Today we're going to talk about a textbook reading strategy called SQ3R. Before we get into what that acronym stands for, let's take a look at what students say about what makes textbook reading challenging. So here's how freshmen responded to that question, ordered from the most common to the least common. So the number one most common complaint that freshmen have about why their textbook reading is complex is that it is hard to find the information that is important. Number two, the subject matter is boring. Number three, the unfamiliar vocabulary makes reading difficult. Number four, the textbook reading, such as the passages or chapters, is pretty long. Number five, the reading level of the text is complex. Number six, the organization and layout of the text can be confusing. Number seven, some textbooks lack visual aids to help comprehension. And number eight, it is hard to take notes while reading a textbook. So take a few moments here, look back through this list, and kind of reflect which of these difficulties might apply to your textbook reading. Okay, so now that we've identified some of the difficulties, let's get into successful ways to interact with our textbook. So here's how not to read your textbook. Got my English exam tomorrow, reading the textbook a day before. So we don't want to take this angry babies approach. Instead, we want to use SQ3R. So SQ3R is an acronym that stands for Survey, Question, Read, Record, and Review. And you can notice from the three different colors that these are actions to take before reading, during reading, and after reading. Now, as you might imagine, adding these steps to your textbook reading might take a bit more time, so we want to make the case to you today that this is a worthwhile use of your time. So now we're going to go step by step and talk about what each of these entails.
So the first step is surveying. As you can imagine, surveying means scanning through the text. We want to ask you to take a few minutes to scan through the following items before you get into the actual reading. Look at the chapter title, the chapter introduction, topic headings, bold or italicized words, charts and pictures, chapter summaries, end of chapter questions. We do this in order to become familiar with the material before we read it and to activate any prior knowledge that we have. This way, when we go into the reading, we have something to connect to. Well, who cares? There's actually a lot of science behind this. Whenever you learn new information, your brain creates new neurons, and it's much easier for your brain to learn new information and create new ones when you can connect that information to existing information, your old neurons. Pre-reading a text gives you the time to survey what you'll learn and start to make connections to what you already know. Then when you read, your neurons will become stronger. You can see up above a picture of a pathway of a strong neural network. Notice all the connections there. These neurons aren't just flying in space throughout our brain with different pieces of information. Instead, they're building bridges together so they can stick in our brain. So let's do an example of surveying. Here are 2 pages from a health textbook. When we first start to look at this textbook, we probably want to be aware of the following features. Are there any typographical aids? Yep, we've got blue font here and red font here. It's a little bit thicker. That probably has to do with, the kinds of headings that are happening here. Take a look at vocab terms like obese and underweight there are highlighted and bolded, and then some definitions are italicized afterwards. We've got some figures over here on the side, charts and graphs that go along with what the reading is going to talk about. We also have review questions and reading checks as we read. So before I even get into the reading, I'm going to see if I've got any connections, any prior knowledge about any of these things. Yep, I've heard about, being obese versus underweight. I know that those are opposites. And so I can imagine that maybe something that has to do with like body composition and BMI together has to do with maintaining weight and health. These are ideas that I have some information from before, but now I can build onto that information as I read. So the next step with SQ3R is to question, to create questions. What we want you to do is to turn section headings of your chapters and inside of the chapters of your books into questions, and then you can start predicting how the section will answer the question as you start to read. We do this in order to set a purpose. So you've got a purpose for your reading so that you know what material is important, so that you're not trying to take it all in at equal importance. Research shows that setting a purpose helps you to remember more information so you don't walk away from the textbook having read 20 pages and forgetting exactly what you read. It also helps make it easier to separate the information that you need to know from the details that you don't if you've got a specific question in mind that can help focus that reading. So let's look back at our health textbook again. We've got this specific heading here, body composition. I can turn that into a specific question to ask myself as I'm reading this question or through this section. We can just write a really easy question here. What is body composition. Even though I have a simple question here to be thinking about as I read, it's going to really help focus my brain so that way I know what I should be thinking about and what I should be able to answer. If I get to the end of the section and I don't know what body composition is, I obviously need to go back and reread. You'll probably imagine that as you start to get into harder classes and start reading harder textbooks, you're going to have to be asking yourself more complicated questions than just a definition question like what is body composition, but here's a good place to start.
All right, so after you do some pre-reading, at some point you're actually going to have to read the textbook. So let's give you a few pointers about how to make that reading most effective. Why do you do it? Well, you need to find information to answer your question from the headings. So you've posed a question, now you actually have to read the information to find your answers to it. And what does it look like? Let's walk through what good textbook reading actually looks like. It's okay to skim the parts that may not be important and to read more quickly over the details that actually aren't helping you answer your question. Then you're going to want to slow down and maybe even read aloud when a section is important and does help you to answer your section heading question. At some points, you may even need to reread more slowly when you didn't get something. So notice your reading rate is going to be varied from a more quick pace from information that's not important to a slower pace and even rereading when information is important. And if you've done all this and you still don't understand it, then it's okay to use another resource to help you explain the information in a new way. So use those figures and tables in the book. Maybe look on Google or even ask a classmate. Sometimes it's just hard to understand the way textbook is explaining something. So after you've put all of those steps in place, if you still don't understand something, it's okay to go outside the textbook. So let's go back to our health textbook here and look at how we might read a sample section. So I'm going to take a look at this body composition section and notice, remember in our previous step, we had asked the question, what is body composition? So I'm going to read that first paragraph and see if I can answer it. Although BMI is a quick, handy way to evaluate your weight, it doesn't tell the whole story. A person who is very muscular, for instance, may have a higher BMI but still be healthy. It's also important to consider your body composition, the ratio of fat to lean tissue in your body. Okay, that last sentence there gave me a definition, so I'm going to go back and reread it more slowly because I was reading pretty quickly to make sure I fully understand it. The ratio of fat to lean tissue in your body. Okay, so I'm thinking through it. I know that term ratio from math is kind of two parts next to each other. Lean tissue to fat are obviously kind of opposite. So I'm looking at this ratio of fat to lean tissue in my body as a way to calculate body composition. Okay, that's kind of making sense to me. So notice I slowed down and I really engaged with that part of the paragraph that's going to help me answer my question. So just as kind of a quick recap about reading textbooks, you're going to want to skim the passage to find the information that will help you answer the heading questions, slow down and read more carefully. You might even want to do things like read the reading check. So here, what does body mass index measure? So I'd want to make sure, I can't answer that question. I better go back and take a look at that section again. Actually read these little boxes like main idea. So the textbook editors are trying to tell you, hey, here's the main idea of this section coming up. Actually just take a brief moment to stop and read that. And maybe slow down when you come to vocab words that are highlighted with their definitions afterwards. So those might be places to slow down and read the definition more carefully. So use the text features to tell you when to speed up and slow down as you're reading. But remember, you don't have to read every single word at a slow pace because there's a lot to read in a textbook.
Next step in SQ3R is the second R, record, actually stopping and taking notes in your notebook. Why do you do it? Well, it's not just because your teacher says you have to, but it's to stop periodically and make sure that you understand what you've read before you move on. It's also to create a record of ideas for later use. Lots of us use our notes before we study for a test for finals or for a unit exam. We can also maybe look back at our record of ideas to prepare to write an essay or to prepare for a discussion in class. So let's look at what good recording looks like as opposed to maybe not so great recording. A lot of us are probably involved in passive note-taking without even realizing it. So let's talk about the difference between passive and active note-taking. Passive note-taking is just underlining or highlighting. Lots of us maybe do this because it's a time-saving endeavor without writing anything on the sides, just underlining or highlighting everything that we read. That's not very strong. Writing down everything that you read in your notebook, that's also kind of passive because you're not thinking about it as you read. Same thing with writing down direct quotes from the text that the author is saying. That's not very active, it's passive, and so is stopping after every single sentence. None of these requires your brain to be involved in any thinking as you take notes, so that's why we would call these ideas passive note-taking. Active note taking, on the other hand, is actually going to require some work of your brain while you read and take down those notes so that you'll remember the information when you walk away. Write down information that answers your heading questions, not every single word. Put down information into your own words using your primary language, even if it's not English. If you can put the information into your own words, you've got a much stronger grasp of it, as if you're just copying down word for word what the book says. Another way to actively note take is to draw diagrams, pictures, tables, etc., to visually represent the text. That way you can see, do I really understand what I'm reading as I'm reading it? Also, use bullet points. Don't worry about writing incomplete sentences as you're taking down notes, because there's no time for that, and you need to stay focused on what your actual purpose is. Finally, stop after meaningful chunks of information. Don't stop after every single sentence. Wait until you get to the end of a paragraph or a section, so that way all the information can be collected together in your brain and you can make connections from idea to idea. So now let's look back at our textbook. We had that section about body composition, and we have our question we're answering, what is body composition? After we practiced reading through this text and we slowed down when we got to the actual definition of body composition, the ratio of fat to lean tissue in your body, we know that this is important enough to write down in our notes. We don't need to copy down the whole paragraph. We don't even need to copy down the whole sentence. Let's just write down that body composition is a ratio. And then we can even use our math type of notation to say this is fat tissue to lean tissue. We can use a colon like we do in our math class. That's all I need to write down, is just that ratio to show that I understand what is body composition. Obviously here I don't probably need to take any further notes, but if I'm in a harder textbook for a harder class as I go through freshman to senior year, I might need to be including way more notes in order to answer maybe a harder heading question as I'm reading.
Okay, so we all know that once we've read and taken notes on a textbook, we're going to have to do some reviewing for later purposes. So why do we do it? Well, we review to move information into long-term memory storage. Our brain is really smart at getting rid of information that it doesn't think we need. It's called pruning. So after every day, if you haven't moved information into that long-term storage, your brain might decide it's not important enough information to hold on to, and it might actually prune it or get rid of it. So what does good reviewing look like? Well, you want to review within 24 hours of reading to move information to long-term storage. If you don't come back within that 24-hour window, your brain may decide, hey, I haven't come back to that information. It's still sitting in my short-term memory. It's probably time to get rid of it. And we don't want that to happen with important textbook information. Then you want to come back to the information regularly, say weekly or so, to remind your information to remind your brain that that is worthwhile information to hold on to. You want to be sure to review in an active way, just like we took notes in an active way. So for example, you might recite information aloud or explain the ideas to a non-expert. Take your mom or your brother or your dog even. And if you can explain to them what molecular means in your own words and break it down in a way that they might understand it, you probably have a pretty good concept of that word. So that's a more active way to review than simply looking over your notes, which is what students often say they do. Create visual representation. So maybe you took your notes in a traditional text format. Well, turn those notes into a chart or a graph or a picture and create connections between different parts of your brain. Write down concepts in a new way. Find a different way to explain those concepts to make sure you truly understand them. And lastly, use the resources provided by your book. Students often ignore the fact that their books have end-of-chapter questions or even sometimes online resources, which can be really helpful interactive ways to review the material. So use those resources to review for unit tests or to prepare for maybe an upcoming debate or essay. So this is what active reviewing looks like. You don't want to simply look over your notes, but you want to be an active participant in the review process. All right, so we've looked over SQ3R, and just to recap, survey to take 3 minutes to look over the chapter and make connections to what you know. Question, turn each section heading into a question to set a purpose. Read the information, slowing down for new and confusing information. Record, use active recording strategies, putting the information into your own words to answer the heading questions. And lastly, review, revisit the material regularly using active review strategies to think through the information. And we hope that you'll agree that using SQ3R will help you study smarter and not harder.